Hello and welcome to Newswire. I am Munib Hamid. Now, the September 11, 2001 attacks on the United States set off a series of events that would see Washington in just a month begin the longest war in the country's history. 20 years later, the United States will mark the anniversary of the attacks less than 2 weeks after completing a chaotic withdrawal from the now Taliban-controlled country. Today is 9/11 and 2,977 innocent people were killed by the terrorists on this day at the World Trade Center. 2,327,876 innocent Muslims were killed by the American forces since 9/11. 20 years later, how has 9/11 changed the world? And did the Al-Qaeda's attack on the US on September 11, 2001 change the way Americans deal with the world and each other? Now, to talk more on this, we have with us Sarwar Naqvi, former ambassador. Welcome to the program, Naqvi. And we have with us Fahad Masood, international security analyst now. So I'm going to start with Mr. Naqvi now. Where does exactly the United States stand after 20 years of a war on terror and then a humiliating defeat by the Taliban?
Well, the US is coming to terms with what happened. You see, the incident of 9/11, in which the World Trade Center was attacked, and there was an aircraft that bombed the Pentagon, parts of the Pentagon, was a landmark event. These are events which come once in a while in history, and they remain ingrained in one's mind, and they have their own impact and repercussions for years and years to come. I mean, 9/11 is one incident or one event which everybody remembers where he was, what he was doing on that day. I was in Vienna, Austria. I was presenting my credentials to the foreign minister, and suddenly somebody came and whispered something in her ears and said that, and she was a lady. She terminated the interview and she said, "Ambassador, the World Trade Center has been attacked and I have to go and give my reaction to the press and the television. So I would like to terminate this meeting." So, I went home and I found that there has been an attack on the World Trade Center and got to see all the... Now, the United States, like a raging bull, it decided to launch this attack on Afghanistan, where the Taliban regime was in power, and it attacked a country which was not directly involved in the event. In fact, 9/11's origin and the reasons why it happened is still not clear. However, the nationals that were involved, none of them was an Afghan national, and they attacked Afghanistan. So that was again a very impulsive, knee-jerk reaction. Pakistan at that time under President Musharraf also joined that war on terror. Now, the war on terror is ephemeral and a very abstract idea. How can you launch war on terror, or war on fear, or war on pessimism, or war on optimism? I mean, there is no war on terror. And then this war on terror in the American media was presented as a war against Islamic terrorists, Muslim terrorists. That again was grossly unfair. And the result of all this was that there has been great polarization and a kind of very unfair and indifferent policies towards the Middle East and towards Muslims who are treated with suspicion and with great reservations. So I think the impact of the 9/11 event was a fallout on the Muslims which was largely unjustified, and the Americans should realize, and they should come to terms with it, and they should try to take a more balanced view of how history evolves, what happens, and what the Americans have a history of reacting like this. When there was the Pearl Harbor attack in the Second World War, the Americans dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I mean, if they have to, like they say, if you want to kill a mosquito, you don't use an artillery gun. So the Americans are the kind of country, are the kind of people whose leaders tend to overreact and cause all kinds of harm and damage to the rest of the world because of their preponderant military power.
Right, now let's have Fahad Masood into the debate. Fahad Masood being an international security analyst. I'm going to throw a question at you now. Fahad, 11th September 2001, 19 members of Al-Qaeda, a group granted sanctuary by the Taliban control of Afghanistan, hijack 4 commercial airliners in the United States, which is the superpower. 2 of the planes are flown into the World Trade Center in New York City, collapsing both the towers. 1 plane is flown into the Pentagon, the seat of the U.S. Department of Defense in Virginia, and the 4th plane crashes into a field in Pennsylvania after passengers on board hearing of the other attack storm the cockpit. Now, Fahad, this is once in a lifetime level of utter blindness by the authorities, intelligence failure and security collapse of the superpower.
I absolutely agree, and the 9/11 Commission that came about in 2004 and submitted their report as soon as they were done with their investigation, they said exactly the same thing. There was a huge failure regarding between the intelligence agencies within the United States. So that was that. But what happened afterwards was more crucial. We have lost about 0.5 million people across the world, may it be the Muslims or for that matter, the other side. But what is important again, we need to move ahead and find a solution to the problem. And the problem remains the difference between the haves and the have-nots, the difference in ideologies, the variation in geoeconomics between the countries across the world. They have always been, post-1979, a possibility of the Mujahideen standing up and going against the West because they were left high and dry as soon as the Soviets went out of Afghanistan, and things went bleak for them. So rest assured, there is a huge trust deficit that has been created between the state itself, which is once again the country of United States of America, and everyone else, which is the world at large. So this thing has to come into play and has to come into an understanding and cognizance that there is no other way to manage the affairs unless until there is some parity, some semblance of thought of peace and security for everyone else who is there. There is always going to be a problem between haves and have-nots. The gap needs to be less wide. It needs to reduce if we want to ensure peace, prosperity, and security for everyone. So it's a big problem for the developed world right now, as well as the developing world. The aircraft that were there utilized once again a huge problem that was identified within the American security establishment, that they were not communicating, coordinating well enough. They've tried to rectify, but there are still loopholes which have been identified, which has been seen globally as well. So I think we have come a long way. The war on terror has not played a very positive role in the geoeconomics and the geopolitics of the world. It has made the world more insecure than anything else. It has not made it secure as what the Americans had planned it to be, but we're looking for some amount of relative ease as soon as Americans exit, but the cards need to be played right. in regional peace, prosperity, and security.
Right, Mr. Naqvi, I'm going to ask you the same question. I mean, the US hasn't been a superpower, let's say, for the past 20 years. It has been for the past many decades being a superpower now. Now, how can this incident happen without the superpower being unable to identify 4 planes flying in their airspace, and then one of them goes and hits the Pentagon, and then 2 hits the Twin Towers? And I mean, this is quite hard to believe on the grassroots level, as a normal civilian, as a normal person in the world, that how is this possible that the US failed being a superpower with all the technology available in hand?
Yes, that is the big question as to why, with all their institutions, technology, and all their paraphernalia of detection, surveillance, and observation, they could not detect these aircraft coming into their airspace, and they let this kind of event occur. I think there is no explanation, but
apart from conspiracy theories that it might be an inside job, just to add on this.
Yeah, well, I mean, yes, you can speculate about it in any manner that one would like to, but the point is that the American system is very vulnerable. You see, America is the United States, where I have lived for a long time because I was on postings in New York at the UN and also in Washington. It is insular. It is a country surrounded by 2 big oceans, and the United States has never faced any direct attack on its mainland. So I think they are not prepared to monitor any kind of threat that might be coming, number one. Number two, there was some kind of basic failure or institutional failure in this particular incident. And I think the United States has now become very careful because of this. They have also created the Department of Homeland Security, which has created another layer of monitoring of people who enter the United States with all kinds of stringent checks and controls. But the United States remains vulnerable because its mindset, its entire psyche is insular, and they don't conceive of external threats even to this day. Despite all their precautions, despite their multi-layered security, they are still vulnerable. That's one thing. The second is that the United States tends to act alone. You see, in all major decisions that the Americans have taken, and I'll cite only 2, in their attack on Iraq and in their attack on Afghanistan, in both instances, the decision was made by the United States without consultation with its allies, without consultation with NATO. So the United States does not deal with these kind of problems in a concerted manner and with collective decision making in this regard. So I think the Americans, because they have these virtually psychological problems, because they just don't conceive of these things, they still remain vulnerable, and God forbid, I don't wish them ill. So I hope nothing happens, but the Americans are quite weak on this front.
Right. Fahad, 20 years after 9/11, how has the world changed?
I would certainly say with the Afghanistan exit of United States, it's looking relatively better. But once again, 20 years down, $5 trillion worth of finance going down the drain, considering the infamous MIC, which is the military-industrial complex, which was mentioned first time by Eisenhower. It has played a hugely negative role within generating war as a business. It has forced the countries across the world, regions to go into turmoil, relative insecurity, and in turn forcing a huge deficit on budgetary claims within the economies of the world. Well, where do we go from here is another question that we need to ask ourselves, and once again, the regional and the global superpowers. Where do they want this world as a whole to go? The globe has grown relatively insecure instead of secure in the previous 20 years. And we need some semblance of peace, prosperity, and security for everyone who becomes a part of this global community. We need to understand this concept of butterfly effect. It goes as if there is a butterfly that flaps its wing in South America, its effect or waves will be felt across the world. And that is how it is in a globalized economy or a globalized world where we are seeing democratization of information technology and finance. The issue of one small incident taking place anywhere across the world will relate to huge problems the world over. Look at the pandemic as we speak. In a globalized world, this is how it happened, where a virus from a small part of the world went global in a matter of days, if not weeks. So in this present scenario, day and time, we need to have understanding. For example, the United Nations has to come into play and become one of the major players in ensuring peace and security for the world. It has not been able to do that for a very long time, and it certainly has come of age since its inception. Yes, it has ensured that the World War III does not take place, but other issues or challenges that have come across post 9/11, just like the war on terror, could have been avoided. Those $5 trillion worth of finance could have been used in healthcare, education, upbringing the downtrodden. The lives lost could have been saved in the bargain. So good, bad, ugly, we have to learn from the errors of the past and make way for better prospects for the generations to come, because that is where the world is heading. And in a globalized world, we need to be very, very sure where we are going, because it is growing more insecure, more intolerant of other societies, cultures, people, and countries at large as well.
Right, now, where does the world stand after 9/11? And we are going to talk about the rise in Islamophobia after 9/11, 20 years after, and obviously during those 20 years after a short break. Stay with us. Welcome back. You're watching Newswire. I'm Muneeb Hamid, and we have with us earlier Sarwar Naqvi, former ambassador, and Fahad Masood, international security analyst, and we are discussing the world after 9/11. And now we are going to put our focus on the rise in Islamophobia and the way Muslims were targeted and termed as terrorists after 9/11. And obviously, the Muslims around the world have faced harshness for these 20 years, and we're still facing those brutalities all over the world, and we call that Islamophobia. Now, Mr. Naqvi, I'll just start with you again now. Muslims termed as the threat instead of terrorism, and Muslims were obviously targeted worldwide. And earlier this month, the New York Times magazine published a feature article profiling a former FBI agent who was imprisoned by the US for exposing the rampant abuses in the government's domestic war on terror. Precisely on the Muslims in the United States. Now, in the piece, Terry Albury recounted the FBI's systematic harassment and intimidation of American Muslims and its spying on the community and its prosecution of many of its members under the guise of combating terrorism. So basically, the Muslims were targeted instead of terrorism.
Yes. You see, I will venture here a personal opinion that the problem of the Western view of Muslims is very old. It goes almost 1,000 years back with the Crusades and with the non-acceptance of Islam by the Roman Catholic Church in Rome, and then by the Protestant movement later on that came about. So this is a historical thing, and there is a prejudice against Muslims in the mind of the Westerners, which is of long standing and almost a kind of ancestral perception. And then when such an event occurs, they latch on to the familiar prejudice that they already have in their mind that the Muslims have done something wrong. In fact, in the immediate aftermath of the 9/11 events, there were incidents when Muslims were being beaten up or being even killed in some small town or some state in the United States here and there. So Islamophobia is a problem of long standing. Now, the more liberal and sensible approach of many Westerners and mainly the academics and the scholars has been that this is wrong and this should not exist. So there is always this kind of dichotomy between what the popular perception is and what the intellectual perception is. Therefore, we have to deal with it. You know, Muslims have always faced hostility, and they continue to do so. In 9/11, it was aggravated, and as a result, there were disturbances around the world. I mean, in many countries, there was hostility against Muslims, even in the UK or in Europe and in other places. That has been very destabilizing. It was only in 2015 that the American administration decided to change its major defense and military target from war on terror, from attacking terrorists or confronting terrorists, to geopolitical rivals or enemies, Russia and China. This happened in the Defense Strategy paper of 2015, and now their target is not the Muslims under the garb of war on terror. So this is a long-standing problem, and I think we have to deal with it. Of course, there have been incidents in Muslim countries which have been, very, very unfortunate. But the point is that most Muslim countries do not support terrorism and do not encourage terrorism. And this is a factor that should be taken into account when this question of Muslim terrorism is looked at.
Right now, before Fahad, I come to you, if you would allow me a minute to share a study revealed that since 9/11, more than half of all terrorism prosecutions involved in the use of paid informants were usually responsible for concocting the plot in collusion with their FBI handles. And obviously talking about the sensationalist media coverage of the most high-profile cases rarely, if ever, made mention of the fact that these conspiracies were the work of the FBI informants. Instead, stories of foiled terror plots like those of the Newswire, 4 of the Fort Dix 5 provided fodder for the continued stigmatization of the American Muslims. And now also with at least 15,000 informants at its disposal, the FBI's rampant infiltration of the mosques and Islamic centers stripped Muslims of any sense of security or sanctity in their own community spaces. And as the entrapment cases unfolded with alarming regularity, it became painfully clear that the war on terror's latest victims were often the community's most vulnerable Muslim members, suffering from poverty, mental health issues, and other difficulties that made them easy prey for the undercover agents. And also, Fahad, to mention 2,327,876 innocent Muslims were killed by the American forces since 9/11. So the question here is, who is the real terrorist? Who is going to be asked, who is going to be brought to accountability for the millions of innocent Muslims murdered all over the world?
Terrorism does not have a religion. That is a famous phrase that has been coined by different news agencies, but the reality remains the same. Anyone or any aspect of society that is not understood by the other is being, as we call it, is afraid of the other. So the scare factor that remains, or the fear factor that remains, plays a huge role in what and how do we go about living in this globalized community. We need to understand both sides of the picture. There are exactly two sides to every coin. There is no other way around it. You have a story, you have an incident taking place. We need to take into account both sides of the picture before we go ahead. Islamophobia is not a term that has come across in the recent past. It has been ongoing for a very long time. It has resulted into issues and challenges for the world. It is also a matter of huge issue in the world across the globalized community, that they need to have some amount of tolerance and justice along the way, without which the world over will continue to fall into turmoil. We need to understand that everyone has a right to live his or her life in the way his or her community desires, the society desires. We cannot leave this as that. But what is important right now is, in a globalized community, it has grown easy rather than challenging to stay connected and communicate with the world. The variance or the change or the difference in belief systems should not be a reason for things to go down under that quick. Patience, tolerance is key, where we are able to generate maximum synergy. Different places or different countries or regions across the world have different qualities, different competencies. If the third or the developing world was not there, the labor or the working community or the class required by the developed world will not be there. So it is an interdependency regime that we need to look at. There is no one who is independent right now. You look at this pandemic where we stand. If and when all people from the developing world are having this two jabs which are there, the developed world will not be secure. So everyone plays a role. The war on terror or the Islamophobic thought has to go away. We need to come onto the negotiation table. We need to talk, communicate in methods more than one. We need to ensure that people are on the same frequency and wavelength where we can generate, once again, synergistic effect.
Right, adding on that, Mr. Naqvi, we still see Muslims being scrutinized and mosques being on a hit list. Muslims seen as potential terrorists worldwide. Now, more than 80,000 Muslim immigrants were called in for questioning by federal agents and required to enroll in a national registry. Now, tens of thousands more were searched and interrogated at airports and prevented from travel through the use of no-fly lists. Simply wearing a headscarf or growing a beard made one a suspect in the eyes of an ever-vigilant police force and a hypersensitive public. Now, the question is, the domestic war on Muslims in every country around the world, is it over?
Well, this is to be seen. I think the prejudice against Muslims, as I said before, is very deep-seated. And I think the attitude of the Muslims who are living in the Western countries is now much more cautious, and they cannot give vent to their aspirations as freely as they used to do. Now, the Americans, by the way, if you look at it in the historical perspective, they have tended to do these kind of things with other nationalities also, or other civilizational groups. Like they put Japanese in detention camps during the Second World War, and then they also have acted against the Chinese at a few times when there was their hostility against communism. So I think this is something that they tend to do. This is a kind of cultural problem with them, but I think Muslims now are more aware of their attitude and are careful. The injustice of looking at Muslims, somebody who has a beard, or somebody who is, or some lady who has a headscarf, is not something that is unusual, because even in Christian societies, if we talk of religious groups, even amongst the Christians, there are people who have beards. In their clergy, there are many who have beards. And the women on many occasions wear a headscarf also. But they then target the Muslims. I think partly that is also racial, because Muslims are not white by and large. So it is their racial prejudice that also comes into play. These are cultural factors that we have to take account of, and I think unless they shed these cultural prejudices, there is bound to be tension between different communities and consequent hostility.
Right, Fahad, you heard Mr. Naqvi's statement. What do you have to say about that? Is there racial injustice? What is the cause behind this prejudice?
Well, it is a deep-rooted issue. It started off once again back in the Crusade Wars, but things have turned for the worse since the 9/11. And there is an issue at hand that is at play all the time, which is once again the racial slurs that come across from both sides of the community. As I mentioned, it is a globalized world. It needs to be tolerant, needs to be patient towards others. It needs to ensure that there is greater acceptance. There is once again an understanding for the with the West that there are certain universal values that are at least spoken of, if not practiced. Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness for the Americans, equality, liberty, fraternity for France. Although things have been going the other way, as my esteemed colleague has mentioned earlier, things need to improve. Once again, this issue at hand is more to do with not understanding the other side. And taken the perspective, if done correctly, things could have or can be improved in the longer run. If we look at where we stand today on the 20th anniversary, a BBC report came out day before or yesterday, which specifically mentioned the same thing, that the Muslims living in America are still feeling the heat of the crashes of 9/11. It should not be this way. We need to have better semblance of understanding that humanity is the bigger play or the bigger role at in the world, instead of looking at regional petty issues which could resolve or result into a lot of problems that could have been easily talked about and discussed and communicated and resolved in the bargain as well. We as a globalized community have to come to this conclusion, otherwise this polarization will continue, which needs to be stopped if we want this place to be more livable, because this earth is the only place that we have to be. There is no other place that can sustain life. So rest assured, we have to be more tolerant. We need to be more acceptable of other people. Their thoughts, beliefs, actions should not be taken as a prejudice, and that is the way forward.
And I mean, obviously the world has to change its attitude towards the Muslims, and obviously they have to identify who the real terrorists are. And the domestic war on Muslims happening right now all across the world needs to be checked. And obviously the authorities need to find out solutions of not targeting Muslims, obviously, and targeting the terrorists instead. Now, thank you very much, Ali Sarwar Naqvi, former ambassador, for joining us on Newswire, and also Fahad Masood, international security analyst. Thank you very much for both of you for joining us on Newswire today. Now, viewers, the teachings of Islam invite people to live a peaceful life based on theism, justice, and purity. Therefore, peace in Islam is an internal constitution. Even the nature of war in Islam is a defensive one, not an offensive one, because the principles of Islam is peace and coexistence, not conflict, violence, and war. The world has to fight a war now for Muslims against Islamophobia and start looking at them as humans as well, not as terrorists. Terrorism or terrorists have nothing to do with Islam or Muslims. This was Newswire. Thank you very much for watching.